Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet hour of reasoning with you. Tell me, is there an old drawer in your home you've never quite emptied, a paper you've kept without knowing why? Watson believed such things hold more than dust. Do subscribe, so these small mysteries find their way to you. Now, settle in. For as Holmes observed, nothing is truly buried while one mind still remembers. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, linked below. Chapter 1. The Solicitor of Lincoln's Inn. It was upon a grey and blustering afternoon in the early days of November that I found myself once more ascending the familiar staircase of 221B Baker Street, summoned thither by a note from my friend Sherlock Holmes which had reached me at my surgery scarcely an hour before. The note itself had been characteristically brief, consisting of but a single line, requesting my presence without delay and bringing your notebook, for I suspect we shall have need of your gift for accurate observation. I confess that such a summons, after some weeks during which Holmes had complained bitterly of the dullness of the season, filled me with a measure of anticipation. London in November is not a city which lends itself to idleness. Yet for Holmes, the absence of some intricate problem to occupy his extraordinary faculties was a torment scarcely to be endured, and I had grown accustomed to recognising in his restless pacing and his irritable answers to Mrs. Hudson's inquiries the certain signs of a mind starved of exercise. When I entered our old sitting-room, however, I discovered that the period of inactivity had evidently come to an end. Holmes was seated in his armchair by the fire, his dressing-gown drawn about him, and across from him, perched upon the edge of the basket-chair with the rigid posture of a man unaccustomed to discomposure, sat a gentleman of perhaps 60 years, dressed with the sober elegance proper to his profession. "Ah, Watson," said Holmes without turning his head, "you are most punctual. Allow me to present Mr. Alistair Fenwick, senior partner of the firm of Fenwick, Mowbray and Pike, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Fenwick has been describing to me a matter which I believe will interest you considerably, for it touches upon documents, dust, and the curious persistence of the past, 3 subjects upon which, as you know, I have something of a weakness." Mr. Fenwick rose and bowed to me with old-fashioned courtesy, though I observed that his hand, when it took mine, was not entirely steady, and that there were shadows beneath his eyes such as come from many sleepless nights. "Dr. Watson," said he, "I have read your accounts of Mr. Holmes's investigations with great interest, though I confess I never imagined I should one day require his services myself. I have spent the whole of my professional life in the quiet pursuit of conveyancing and probate, and I had thought myself proof against the sort of melodrama which, if you will forgive me, your narratives sometimes suggest. I find I was mistaken. Pray, Mr. Fenwick," said Holmes, settling back into his chair and regarding our visitor through half-closed eyes, "begin again from the beginning, for Dr. Watson's benefit, and omit nothing, however trivial it may appear to you. It is precisely the trivial matters which most often prove, upon examination, to be the hinges upon which the whole case turns." Fenwick drew a breath and began. "Our firm," he said, "has occupied the same premises near the Royal Courts of Justice for upward of 80 years. We are not a large concern, but we are, I may say without undue pride, a respected one, and our clients include several families of considerable standing. Among the duties which fall to us is the safe-keeping of documents of the utmost importance, wills, trust deeds, settlements, and the like, which we preserve in a vault beneath our offices, a chamber of considerable strength, secured by a single iron door requiring 2 separate keys, one of which I hold myself, and the other of which is entrusted to my junior partner, Mr. Harold Mowbray." "A sensible precaution," Holmes murmured, "though, as we shall see, not perhaps as impregnable as its designer supposed. Continue." "For some 3 weeks now," Fenwick went on, "I have been receiving letters. They come by post, are unsigned, and the hand is disguised. Printed, in fact, rather than written, in a manner clearly intended to defeat any attempt at identification. The letters themselves are brief, and at first I confess I took them for the work of some disgruntled former clerk, or perhaps a client dissatisfied with the outcome of some long-settled matter. But their content has troubled me more with each that arrives, for they refer again and again to a matter which I had believed entirely closed, a matter from 25 years ago. "You have the letters with you?" Holmes asked, extending a thin hand. "I have brought the 3 most recent." Fenwick produced from his breast pocket a small bundle of papers, which Holmes received and spread upon his knee. I rose and looked over his shoulder. Each letter was short, the paper of good quality but unremarkable, the printed characters formed with what appeared to be a steel pen rather than the more usual pencil. The first read simply, "Some doors, once opened, cannot again be closed." The second, "Ask Mr. Pike what became of the Graves matter." The third and most recent was longer and ran, "There are those among you who slept soundly for 25 years upon a bed they did not earn. The year was 1887. Some of us have not forgotten." Holmes studied each in turn with great care, holding them to the light, and I noticed him pay particular attention to the manner in which the paper had been folded, and to a faint indentation in the corner of the second sheet which might have been made by a pin or a paper clip. "You are familiar, I take it," said Holmes at length, looking up, "with the year 1887, and with this Graves matter to which the second letter refers." A change came over Fenwick's countenance, so slight that I might not have remarked it, had I not been watching for it, but unmistakable none the less. It was the look, I thought, of a man who has heard a name he had hoped never to hear again. He began, and paused. "There was a matter, yes, in that year, concerning an inheritance dispute. It was resolved according to law, Mr. Holmes, and resolved correctly. I can say no more than that, for the details remain, even now, subject to professional confidence." "Of course," said Holmes smoothly, though I caught the gleam in his eye that told me he had marked the hesitation, and would not forget it. "And Mr. Pike, this is, I collect, a member of your firm?" "He was, some years ago. Edgar Pike served as a court clerk in those days, and has since retired, though he yet lives nearby and occasionally assists us with old records, his memory for such matters being remarkable. He is, I should say, a nervous man by temperament, and has seemed unusually distressed of late, though he has said nothing to me of these letters, nor I to him." "And there are others connected with your firm whose names I should know?" "There is Mr. Mowbray, my junior partner, of whom I have spoken. There is Miss Clara Ashcroft, who has charge of our archives, a most capable young woman, without whom I sometimes think the firm could not function at all. And among our clients there is Sir Julian Verner, whose family's affairs we have managed for 3 generations, and the Reverend Tobias Henshaw, who has long been associated with the Verner family, and who occasionally calls upon us regarding matters of charitable trust." "I see." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where he stood for a moment looking down into the street, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Fenwick, I confess that upon the evidence of these letters alone I can tell you little, save that their author writes with a fluency and a command of phrase which suggests an educated hand, and that the consistent reference to a single year argues a memory both long and bitter. But letters such as these rarely come without purpose, and a purpose so long delayed is, in my experience, the most dangerous kind. I should like, with your permission, to visit your offices tomorrow, and to meet those persons whose names you have given me. Watson, you will accompany me?" "Naturally," said I. "Then it is settled. Mr. Fenwick, I would ask only this in the meanwhile. Say nothing to anyone of our visit, and take care, this night particularly, that the vault is properly secured." Fenwick rose, and I thought there was something almost pathetic in the gratitude with which he shook Holmes's hand. "I shall do as you say, Mr. Holmes. I confess I had not expected. That is, I had hoped the matter might prove some foolish prank, and nothing more. But I find, the longer I consider it, that I'm afraid, though I could not tell you precisely of what." "That," said Holmes quietly when our visitor had gone, "is very often the truest fear of all, Watson, the fear of a thing one cannot name, because one has spent 25 years training oneself not to look at it directly. He said no more that evening, but I observed that he sat long into the night with the 3 letters spread before him upon the table, and that the year 1887, written upon a slip of paper in his own hand, lay pinned to the mantelpiece when at last I retired. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Records. The offices of Fenwick, Mowbray and Pike occupied the ground and first floors of a narrow brick building in a court off Chancery Lane, one of those quiet enclaves where the bustle of the city seems to soften, as though out of respect for the gravity of the business conducted within. A brass plate, dulled by years of London grime, bore the names of the partners in lettering so worn that I could barely trace the final word, and a porter in a faded green coat admitted us with the deference proper to expected guests. Holmes paused in the entrance hall before we had gone 3 steps, and I saw his eyes travel with the swiftness I had so often observed and so seldom anticipated, over the worn matting upon the floor, the umbrella stand, and a small brass bell suspended beside the inner door. "You will notice, Watson," said he in a low voice, "that the matting before the inner door is considerably more worn upon the left side than upon the right. A small matter, but it tells us that visitors to this firm, or perhaps members of it, habitually favour that side in passing, which would seem to indicate a door or a passage, opening from the left of the hall beyond. We shall see presently whether I am correct." We were shown into a long room lined with shelves of calf-bound volumes, where Mr. Fenwick rose to greet us with evident relief, and where I was now introduced in turn to the persons of whom he had spoken the previous evening. Mr. Harold Mowbray was a tall man of perhaps 35, with the brisk, confident manner of one accustomed to success, and a handshake a shade too hearty for my taste. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I will own that I think this whole business a great fuss over nothing, some disappointed litigant venting his spleen upon paper, no doubt. But Fenwick insisted, and I am not the man to stand in the way of his comfort, however needless the precaution." "Needless precautions," Holmes observed mildly, "have a way of proving themselves otherwise, Mr. Mowbray, generally at the moment when it is too late to take them. But I thank you for your candour." Miss Clara Ashcroft was a young woman of perhaps 28, neatly dressed in dark grey, with quick intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers that spoke of long hours among the firm's papers. She greeted us with a composure that I thought, even at that early stage, somewhat remarkable in one whose place of work had lately become the subject of anonymous threats. "I have charge of the archive room and the vault index, Dr. Watson," she told me, as we walked together toward the rear of the building, "though I confess these letters have quite unsettled me. I have gone through every entry relating to the year in question, and I can find nothing at all that seems to me extraordinary." "And yet," said Holmes, who had drawn near without my noticing, "you have gone through them. That is to say, Mr. Fenwick mentioned the year to you?" "He did, Mr. Holmes, only yesterday, when he told us of the letters, and asked that we none of us speak of them outside these walls." "I see. And what did you find?" "Very little, beyond the ordinary business of any year. Several conveyances, 2 or 3 wills proved, a handful of trust settlements. There was one matter, an inheritance dispute concerning the Werner estate, which was decided against the claimant, but that is recorded as having been settled entirely according to law, and I can see nothing irregular in the papers." "The Werner estate," Holmes repeated softly, and I saw him glance toward a stout elderly gentleman who stood near the window, his hands folded upon the head of a walking stick, regarding us with an expression of polite but distant interest. This, Fenwick informed us, was Sir Julian Werner himself, who had called that morning upon some matter of business, and had remained, at Fenwick's request, to be introduced to us. Beside him stood a clergyman of advanced years, the Reverend Tobias Henshaw, whose face wore the benign, slightly abstracted look of a man more at home in a country parish than amid the bustle of legal London. "A curious business this," said Sir Julian, when Holmes had been presented to him, "though I confess I can offer you little assistance, Mr. Holmes. My family's affairs have been in Fenwick's hands, and his father's before him, for longer than I can well remember, and I have never had occasion to doubt the thoroughness of their care." "You will forgive my asking, Sir Julian," said Holmes, "but were you aware of any matter in the year 1887 touching your family's estate?" There was the briefest pause, so brief that I doubt I should have noticed it, had I not been schooled by long association with Holmes to watch for precisely such moments, before Sir Julian answered. "I was a young man then, Mr. Holmes, newly come into my inheritance upon my father's death, and there was, I believe, some small matter of a disputed claim, which was disposed of in the usual course. I cannot say I have given it a thought in 20 years. "Quite so," murmured the Reverend Henshaw, in the soft, musical voice of the pulpit. "A most unfortunate affair, that, though, I dare say—" He stopped abruptly, and a faint flush rose to his cheeks. "That is to say, I recall very little of it. My memory for legal matters has never been strong." "Unfortunate," Holmes repeated with great gentleness as though tasting the word. "You used that word, Mr. Henshaw, before correcting yourself. I wonder, was the matter unfortunate for the firm, or for some person concerned in it?" I really cannot say, Mr. Holmes. It was a great while ago, and I am an old man with an old man's failing memory. You must not place too much weight upon a careless choice of words." Holmes bowed and said no more upon the subject, but I observed that his eyes lingered a moment longer upon the clergyman's face before he turned away, and that there was in his expression a quality I had learned to recognise, not suspicion precisely, but something gentler, and in its way more troubling, the look of a man who has glimpsed beneath a placid surface the shadow of an old grief. It was Fenwick himself who proposed, a little later, that we should descend to the vault, that Holmes might examine the security arrangements of which he had spoken the previous evening, and it was on our way thither, passing through a narrow corridor lined with deed boxes, that we encountered a small, stooped man of perhaps 70, dressed in clothes a decade out of fashion, who started visibly at the sight of us and seemed for a moment uncertain whether to advance or retreat. "Ah, Pike," said Fenwick with what I thought a forced heartiness. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes of whom I spoke. He is good enough to look into a small matter for us." Mr. Edgar Pike's hand, when he extended it, trembled so perceptibly that I noticed it even before Holmes could have done so, and his face, already pale, seemed to grow paler still. "Mr. Holmes," he said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, I am sure I hope it is nothing serious. If you will excuse me, I have some papers to attend to." He shuffled away with a haste that bordered upon flight, and I saw Holmes watch him go with an expression of grave attention. "There, Watson," said he quietly when Pike had vanished round the corner, "is a man carrying a weight that has grown too heavy for him. Whether it concerns the present matter or some private trouble of his own, I cannot yet say, but I should be very much surprised if we do not hear more of Mr. Edgar Pike before this affair is concluded." We descended then to the vault, a chamber of grey stone beneath the building, secured by a single great door of iron, into which Fenwick fitted his key with evident pride in its construction, explaining to Holmes the mechanism of the locks and the system of 2 keys by which the chamber was secured. Holmes examined the door, the hinges, and the lock itself with minute care, asking a number of questions which seemed to me at the time of no great moment, but which I was to remember very differently before another day had passed. That evening, as we sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street, a note was brought up by the boy in buttons, a plain envelope, addressed in the same disguised, printed hand as those Fenwick had shown us. Holmes opened it without comment, read the single line it contained, and passed it to me without a word. "The dead remember," it ran, "what the living conceal." Holmes said nothing for a long while, but sat gazing into the fire with his pipe unlit between his fingers, and when at last he spoke it was only to remark in a tone I had rarely heard him use, "I begin to fear, Watson, that we have arrived a little too late." Chapter 3. The Locked Vault. I was awakened the following morning by a sound I had long since learned to associate with crisis, the sharp, repeated rapping of a cab whip handle against our street door, followed by voices raised upon the stair, and Mrs. Hudson's tread, hurried and anxious, ascending before them. "Mr. Holmes, sir, a telegram, and a gentleman below who will not wait." Holmes was already at the door in his dressing gown, the telegram in his hand almost before Mrs. Hudson had finished speaking. I saw his face change as he read it, not with surprise, I thought, so much as with the grim satisfaction of a man whose worst apprehension has been confirmed. "Read it, Watson," said he, passing me the slip and reaching at the same moment for his coat. "We are wanted at Lincoln's Inn without delay. Mr. Fenwick has been found dead." The telegram from Inspector Lestrade was brief to the point of bareness. "Fenwick found dead in vault this morning. Door locked from within. Come at once." We were in a cab within 5 minutes, rattling through streets still half asleep beneath a low and sullen sky. And during the whole of that short journey, Holmes spoke not a word, but sat with his chin sunk upon his breast and his eyes half closed, in the attitude I had come to recognise as one of intense, concentrated thought. At the offices we found a scene of considerable confusion. A constable stood at the outer door, and within, gathered in the long room where we had been received the day before, were Mowbray, Miss Ashcroft, and old Pike, the last of these so white and shaken that I thought he might at any moment require my professional attention. Lestrade himself met us in the corridor, his sharp little face unusually grave. "This is an ugly business, Mr. Holmes," said he, "and I don't mind telling you I'm glad you're here, though I fancy the explanation when we come to it will prove simple enough. Robbery, most likely, with murder following upon discovery, though how the fellow got out again locking the door behind him is more than I can presently say." "Suppose you show us," said Holmes quietly, "rather than tell us. I find that vaults, like patients, Lestrade, are best examined before they are diagnosed." We descended the narrow stair to the vault, and there, in the doorway, Lestrade paused and stood aside, that we might see for ourselves. The great iron door stood open now, but it had not been opened easily. I could see, even from where I stood, the marks of a crowbar upon the frame, where the bolts had been forced from without. Within, upon the stone floor, amid scattered papers and the overturned contents of a dispatch box, lay the body of Alistair Fenwick, upon his back, his spectacles broken beside him, and an expression upon his thin face that was not, I thought, one of pain so much as of profound and final astonishment. I knelt and made such examination as the circumstances permitted. "He has been dead some hours, Holmes. 6, perhaps 7. There is a contusion here, upon the temple, which I should say was the immediate cause of death, though I can form no opinion as yet regarding the instrument." "And the door, Lestrade," said Holmes, rising and turning to examine the frame with great attention, "was locked from within, you say? Explain to me precisely what you mean by that." "I mean, Mr. Holmes, that when Pike came down this morning to fetch certain papers, he found the door locked and bolted exactly as it is built to be locked from the inside, that is, with the great bar drawn across, which can only be done by a hand standing within this chamber. Both keys, moreover, are accounted for. Mowbray's was in his own possession, locked in his desk, and Fenwick's." He gestured toward a small ring of steel lying near the dead man's hand. "Was here, upon the floor beside him. We were obliged to force the door from without, as you see, there being no other way to reach him." "And the packet," said Holmes, and I saw a sudden sharpening of his attention. "The sealed packet from the year 1887, of which Miss Ashcroft spoke yesterday. Where is it now?" It was Miss Ashcroft herself who answered, from the doorway behind us, her voice not quite steady. "It is gone, Mr. Holmes. I checked the index this morning the moment I heard. It was the first thing I thought of, God forgive me, before I had even taken in that poor Mr. Fenwick was—" She stopped and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "The packet is gone, and the entry in the register has been altered, the date changed, so that it appears to have been removed a fortnight since, upon Mr. Fenwick's own authority." "Altered how recently?" "I cannot say with certainty, Mr. Holmes, but the ink is fresher than the surrounding entries. I'm sure of that much. Lestrade, who had been listening with the air of a man who finds such details tiresome beside the plain fact of a murder, now drew Holmes a little aside, though not so far that I could not hear him. "I'll tell you how I read it, Holmes, and you may correct me if you find fault. Whoever did this knew the firm, knew its papers, and wanted that packet badly enough to kill for it. Now who stands to gain? Mowbray takes the senior partnership upon Fenwick's death. That's motive enough for some men. And Sir Julian Verner, I am told, has a reason to fear what old documents might say about his family's fortune, should they come to light. Either way, it's robbery and murder, plain enough, and the locked door's a puzzle for the locksmith, not for the detective." "You may be right, Lestrade," said Holmes, in a tone that I, who knew him well, recognised as conveying precisely the opposite meaning. "I should like, nevertheless, to speak with each of those present separately and at leisure. A crime of robbery committed by a stranger with a crowbar has a certain coarseness about it, and this case, whatever else it may prove to be, does not strike me as coarse." We spent the better part of that morning in a small office adjoining the library, where Holmes questioned, in turn, each member of the household. I shall not set down the whole of what was said, for much of it concerned matters of routine. The hour at which the offices had been locked the previous evening, who had last seen Fenwick alive, and so forth. But certain points struck me forcibly even as they passed, and I noted them carefully in my book as Holmes had bidden me. Mowbray's account was given with the same brisk confidence he had shown the day before, yet I observed that his hands, when he was not speaking, were not entirely still, and that he returned, more than once and without prompting, to the subject of his own whereabouts the previous evening, a subject upon which, it seemed to me, no one had yet pressed him. Miss Ashcroft wept a little, but answered every question with a precision that did her credit, and it was she who first remarked, almost in passing, as though it were a small thing, that Fenwick had asked her, only the previous afternoon, to bring him the master index of the vault's contents, for he said he wished to satisfy himself upon a point of some importance, though he did not say what. But it was old Pike whose interview affected me most. He answered Holmes's questions in a voice so low that I was obliged to lean forward to catch his words, and when Holmes asked him, almost casually, whether he had ever had occasion, in the course of his long service, to handle documents relating to the Verner estate, the old man's composure broke entirely. He did not weep, nor did he protest. He simply sat for a long moment in silence, his hands working together upon his knee, and then said, in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, "I have handled a great many documents, Mr. Holmes, in 40 years. A great many. I could not undertake to remember them all." "No," said Holmes gently, "I dare say you could not. And yet I think, Mr. Pike, that there are some things a man does not forget, however much he might wish to." Pike said nothing further, and presently was permitted to withdraw, but I saw Holmes watch him go with the same grave attention he had shown the previous day, and when we were alone once more, he turned to me with an expression I had seldom seen upon his face, a kind of sorrowful certainty, as of a man who sees gathering upon the horizon a storm he cannot avert. "Lestrade believes this a simple matter of theft and violence, Watson," said he, "and he may yet persuade a jury of it. But theft does not weep, and violence does not carry for 25 years the look that I have seen this morning upon more than one face in this house. We are not investigating a robbery. We are investigating a debt long overdue and paid at last in the only coin that remained." Chapter 4. Ink, Dust and Silence. It was Holmes's habit, when a case had reached that stage at which the principal facts have been gathered but their meaning has not yet declared itself, to withdraw for a time from the company of those concerned, and to occupy himself with the physical evidence alone, as though the silent testimony of objects might speak more honestly than the words of men. So it was that, when the body of poor Fenwick had been removed and Lestrade had gone off to make his report, Holmes asked that the vault and the rooms adjoining it be left undisturbed, and spent the whole of that afternoon in an examination so minute and so prolonged that I confess my own attention, less practised than his in such matters, began to flag long before his did. He began with the vault itself, going over every inch of the floor upon his hands and knees with the aid of his lens, and paying particular attention to the great iron bar by which the door was secured from within. "You will observe, Watson," said he, after some 20 minutes of this employment, "that the bar runs in a groove along the inner face of the door, and is drawn across by means of this handle, here, into a socket cut into the stone of the frame. It is a sound piece of work, and older, I should say, than the rest of the fittings, which suggests it was installed at some earlier period, perhaps when the vault was first constructed, and has simply been retained because it answers its purpose well enough." "That seems plain enough," said I. "What of it?" "Only this, that a bar which has been drawn and withdrawn for 30 years or more does not move with perfect silence, nor with perfect ease, and a man unfamiliar with its particular character might find it stiffer or looser than he expected. I've tried it a dozen times this afternoon, Watson, and each time it requires a particular pressure, applied first downward and then across, before it will run home. A stranger, fumbling with such a mechanism in haste or in the dark, would very likely fail to secure it at all on the first attempt." "You mean that the door might have been left unbolted despite appearances?" "I mean nothing yet," said Holmes, with a touch of his old asperity. "I observe only that the bar is peculiar, and that peculiarity, in my experience, is a fact to be noted rather than explained away. Let us proceed." He turned next to the register, the great bound ledger in which every removal from the vault was recorded, with date, document, and the signature of the person authorizing its withdrawal. The entry concerning the 1887 packet was, as Miss Ashcroft had said, dated some 14 days previous, and bore Fenwick's own initials. But Holmes, holding the page up to the window so that the light fell upon it at an angle, gave a small exclamation of satisfaction. "Come here, Watson, and look at this through my lens. You will see that the ink of this entry, though it has been blotted in the usual way, lies upon the paper with a slight gloss that the surrounding entries, written by their dates some weeks or months earlier, have entirely lost. Ink dries, Watson, but it does not dry all at once. The surface loses its sheen within a few hours, but a certain quality of the gloss, visible only under close examination, persists for some days longer. This entry, I should say, was made within the last 48 hours, and very probably within the last 24. "Then the alteration was made after Fenwick's death," said I, beginning to see his meaning, "not before it, as Miss Ashcroft supposed." "It would appear so, and that is a fact of some importance, Watson, for it means that whoever altered this register did so with full knowledge that Fenwick was already dead, and with leisure enough thereafter to come to this room, take down this volume, and falsify an entry with a steady hand. That is not the act of a man fleeing in panic from a crime he has just committed. It is the act of a man putting his house in order." He passed on to a second matter, a slim ledger of an older pattern, bound in marbled boards, which Miss Ashcroft had identified as one of the firm's old daybooks, recording the routine business of the office in years long past. Holmes turned its pages with great care until he came to a place, perhaps 2/3 through the volume, where a leaf had been removed, not torn roughly but cut close to the binding with some sharp instrument, so cleanly that only the closest examination revealed the gap at all. "The daybook for the autumn of 1887, said Holmes, tapping the mutilated page, "and here, Watson, where a single leaf has been removed, we may be tolerably certain we should have found some entry, an attendance, a memorandum, the receipt of some document, which someone considered too dangerous to be allowed to remain. Observe, too, that the cut is old, the edges have darkened with age, quite differently from the fresh ink we examined a moment ago. This was not done yesterday, Watson, nor last week. This was done long ago, perhaps at the very time the events themselves occurred." "Then there have been 2 concealments," I said slowly, "separated by 25 years, one old and one new." "Just so. And it is the relation between those 2 concealments, Watson, that lies at the heart of this case. though I do not yet see the whole of it." He set the daybook aside and turned to a third object, a sheet of memorandum paper lying upon Fenwick's own desk, bearing some figures and a date in the dead man's hand, beneath which, when Holmes held it at an angle to the light, there appeared the faint indentations of writing that had once occupied the page above it, now removed. "A leaf has been torn from this pad also," said Holmes, "and recently, within the last day or two, I should think, for the impression is sharp. Fenwick wrote something here, Watson, on a sheet now missing, and pressed hard enough that his pencil left its mark upon the page beneath. I cannot read it with certainty, but I can make out here what appears to be a name, beginning with the letters G.R.A. And here a date, which I believe to be the 17th of October, 1887. "Graves," I said. "The name Miss Ashcroft mentioned, the claimant in the Verner dispute." "Precisely. It would seem that Fenwick himself, in the last days of his life, was occupied in setting down some note concerning this very matter, a note now vanished, as the packet itself has vanished." Holmes laid the sheet down and stood for a moment in silence, his brows drawn together. "We have, then, dust patterns near the filing cabinets which suggest that drawers not opened in years have lately been disturbed, an altered register, a missing leaf, old and recent, and a dead man who spent his last hours, it appears, in quiet research into a matter the firm had long considered closed. Lestrade would have us believe that some stranger broke in for plunder. I tell you, Watson, that everything in this room speaks not of violence from without, but of a reckoning from within, a settling of old accounts, conducted with extraordinary care, by someone who knew this house and these papers better than any stranger could. But who, Holmes? Mowbray has the strongest motive, surely. He gains the partnership." "Motive," said Holmes with something like weariness, "is the least reliable of all evidence, Watson, for it is the one thing every man possesses in abundance, and the one thing every man is most practised in concealing. I am more interested just at present in something Lestrade has overlooked entirely, the demeanour this morning of those who have least to gain. Mowbray, who profits most, was shaken, certainly, but composed. A man, I should say, genuinely startled by an event he had not foreseen, however convenient he may privately find it. Sir Julian, who has perhaps the most to lose should old scandals surface, received the news this morning, I am told, with scarcely a flicker of surprise. But Pike, who stands to gain nothing, who has neither partnership nor property nor reputation now remaining to him beyond what little dignity attends a quiet old age. Pike alone, of all of them, looked this morning like a man who has seen a ghost he has been expecting for 25 years. He fell silent and began methodically to fill his pipe, a sure sign, as I had learned, that some process of reasoning had reached a point beyond which he did not yet care to speak. I asked him no further questions that evening, but as we returned to Baker Street through the gathering dusk, I found myself turning over, again and again, the image of old Pike's trembling hands, and wondering what burden a man might carry, silently, for a quarter of a century, before it grew too heavy to be borne. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Beneficiary. For the 2 days that followed, Holmes was scarcely to be seen. He left Baker Street early each morning and returned late, dusty and often in poor humour, with the particular irritability that I had come to recognise as the outward sign of a mind labouring against some obstinate barrier of fact. I knew better than to question him closely during such periods, and contented myself with such fragments of information as he chose from time to time to let fall. "I have spent the morning, Watson," said he, on the evening of the second day, throwing himself into his chair with the air of a man whose patience has been sorely tried, among the files of the probate registry, and an afternoon besides at Somerset House, in the company of clerks whose devotion to procedure is exceeded only by their indifference to the passage of human lives across the documents they guard. But I have learned something for all that, and I think you will find it worth the telling." He drew from his coat a sheaf of notes, closely written, and spread them upon the table between us. In the autumn of 1887, he began, there came before the Chancery Division a petition concerning the estate of the late Sir Marcus Verner, the father, Watson, of the gentleman we met 2 days ago. Sir Marcus had died some months previously, leaving an estate of very considerable value, the bulk of which passed under the terms of his will to his son, the present Sir Julian. But the petition I speak of was brought by another claimant, a young woman, then 25 years of age, by the name of Eleanor Graves. Graves, I repeated. The name from the indentation on Fenwick's memorandum pad. The same. Miss Graves's claim, as set out in the petition, was a startling one. She asserted that she was the natural daughter of Sir Marcus Verner, born of a connection formed some 30 years earlier, before his marriage, and that Sir Marcus had, in the last years of his life, executed a codicil to his will, acknowledging her as his daughter and providing for her out of the estate, a codicil which, she claimed, had been improperly suppressed. A grave charge, said I, and one not easily proved, I should think, after the principal's death. Grave indeed. And yet, Watson, the petition did not fail for want of proof. It failed because the proof, once produced, was found to be false. Miss Graves's case rested upon a letter, said to be in Sir Marcus's own hand, referring to the existence of the codicil and to his intentions toward her, and upon the testimony of a witness who claimed to have seen the codicil itself, signed and sealed, among Sir Marcus's papers shortly before his death. When the matter came to be examined, the letter was found, upon expert evidence, to be a forgery, a clever one, but a forgery nonetheless, and the witness, under cross-examination, broke down and confessed that his testimony had been mistaken. The petition was dismissed. Miss Graves was held liable for the cost of the suit, which ruined her utterly, and, here is the detail, Watson, which I confess struck me most forcibly of all, within a 12-month she had vanished from London entirely, and no further record of her exists in any registry I have been able to consult. Vanished? Vanished. I have searched the records of 3 parishes in which she's known to have lodged, and find nothing, no marriage, no death, no removal recorded. A young woman of 25 does not simply cease to exist, Watson, save in one of 2 ways. Either she changed her name and her circumstances so completely as to leave no trace, which speaks of a desperation I do not care to contemplate, or he did not finish the sentence, but I understood him well enough. And the witness who recanted, I said, after a moment, who was he? That, said Holmes with a thin smile, is the question I spent the better part of this afternoon in answering, and I had my answer at last from a clerk at Somerset House, who remembered the case. He was a junior at the time, and the scandal of it, small as it was, had evidently impressed itself upon him. The witness's name, Watson, was Edgar Pike. I confess that, though I had half expected some such revelation, the confirmation of it struck me with considerable force. Pike, I said. Then it was he who broke down the case against Eleanor Graves, he who, by his recantation, ensured that the estate passed to Sir Julian. It would appear so, and there is more, Watson, for the expert who examined the supposed letter from Sir Marcus and pronounced it a forgery, the evidence upon which the whole petition ultimately founded, was retained, according to the records, by the solicitors then acting for the estate. That is to say, by the firm of which our late client was at that time a junior partner of perhaps 30 years of age. Fenwick himself? Fenwick himself? And the principal beneficiary of the whole proceeding, Watson, the man into whose hands the estate passed intact and unencumbered, upon the dismissal of Miss Graves's claim, was the late Sir Marcus's only legitimate son, then a young man new to his inheritance, and now Sir Julian Verner, Baronet, of whom we have lately had the honour to make acquaintance. I sat for some time turning these facts over in my mind, while Holmes refilled his pipe and watched me with the patient air of a schoolmaster awaiting a pupil's conclusions. It seems plain enough, said I at last, that these 3 men, Fenwick, Pike and Verner, were each, in their different ways, concerned in the defeat of Eleanor Graves's claim. But Holmes, the claim was dismissed because the evidence supporting it was found to be false. If the letter truly was a forgery, and Pike's recantation truly was honest, then no wrong was done. The law took its proper course, however hard the result for Miss Graves. If, said Holmes quietly, the letter truly was a forgery, if Pike's recantation truly was honest, you put your finger, Watson, without knowing it, upon the very crux of the matter, for it is precisely those two ifs that the missing leaf from the daybook and the missing packet from the vault would have settled one way or the other 25 years ago. Someone, Watson, has lately come to doubt that those ifs were ever answered honestly. Someone has been asking questions, of Pike principally, if the second letter to Fenwick is any guide, and someone, I think, has come very near to proving that Eleanor Graves's claim was not false at all, but true, and that the evidence which destroyed her was manufactured deliberately and with skill by men who stood to gain a fortune by her ruin. And Fenwick, I asked, where does he stand in all this? Victim or conspirator? That, said Holmes, rising and crossing to the window, where the lamps of Baker Street glowed faintly through the evening mist, is the question upon which the whole case now turns, Watson, and I confess I do not yet know the answer with certainty. But I will tell you this much. A man does not spend the last days of his life quietly researching the ruin of a woman he himself helped to destroy, unless something has changed within him, unless after 25 years his conscience has at last begun to ask questions that his ambition, in his youth, was content to leave unasked. If Fenwick was a conspirator once, Watson, I begin to suspect he died as something very different. A man attempting at the 11th hour to undo a wrong he had helped to commit, and struck down for his pains by someone who could not afford to let the truth be told. Chapter 6. The Weight of Old Secrets. It was upon the morning following Holmes's account of the Graves petition that there occurred an incident which, though brief, I have always considered to mark the true turning point of the case, not in the sense that it furnished any new fact of evidence, but in the sense that it altered decisively the spirit in which Holmes pursued the matter thereafter. We had gone again to Lincoln's Inn, ostensibly that Holmes might examine once more certain papers in the archive room, but in truth I think because he wished to observe at close quarters and without the formality of an interview the bearing of those persons whose names had now become so entangled with the events of 25 years before. Miss Ashcroft received us with her customary composure, though I thought her paler than before, and it was she who, in the course of conversation, made a remark that brought Holmes to instant and complete attention. "I have been thinking, Mr. Holmes," said she, "of what you asked me yesterday, whether any other documents relating to the Verner matter had ever been removed from the vault. I told you then that I could find no record of it, and that remains true, so far as the vault register is concerned. But it occurred to me last night that there is another book, an older one, kept before my time, recording not removals from the vault itself, but the circulation of documents between this office and counsel's chambers for the purposes of litigation. I had quite forgotten its existence, for it has not been used in years." "And you have found something in it," said Holmes with a quietness that I, who knew him, recognised as suppressed eagerness. "I have found this, Mr. Holmes." She produced a slim volume bound in faded green cloth and opened it to a page she had marked. Here, under the date of the 9th of October 1887, is recorded the dispatch of certain papers to counsel retained in the Graves matter, among them a bundle described only as letters, Sir M.V. to E.G., various dates. And here, 10 days later, is recorded their return, save that against this second entry someone has written, in pencil, a single word, which I confess I cannot account for. She turned the book toward us, and Holmes bent over it with his lens. The word, written small and close against the margin, was genuine. "Genuine," Holmes repeated softly. "Watson, do you see what this means? The letter produced at the hearing, the letter pronounced a forgery, upon which Miss Graves's whole case was made to founder, was not the only letter from Sir Marcus Verner to his daughter that existed in 1887. There was a bundle of such letters, various dates, sent to counsel for examination 10 days before the hearing, and returned with this single word appended, a word which can only mean that someone, examining them, judged them to be authentic. Then the letters that were genuine were never produced, I said slowly, and the one that was produced, the one pronounced a forgery, was very probably a forgery indeed, said Holmes, but a forgery substituted for the genuine article by someone who had access to both and who understood that a single false letter, exposed as such before the court, would discredit Miss Graves's entire case far more effectively than the suppression of genuine evidence could ever do, for a claimant who has been shown to rely upon forged proof is a claimant whom no one troubles to hear further, however true her underlying claim may be. He closed the book gently. It is a device of great subtlety, Watson, cruel but subtle, and I confess I had not until this moment fully appreciated the depth of the wrong that was done. But who could have effected such a substitution? It would require access to the genuine letters, knowledge of the proceedings, and skill enough to produce a forgery that would deceive the court's own expert. Access, knowledge, and skill, Holmes repeated. 3 qualities, Watson, which were possessed in 1887 by remarkably few persons connected with this case, but which were possessed in combination by at least one. Fenwick, as junior partner, had access to the papers and knowledge of the proceedings, but I have seen nothing to suggest in him any particular skill at forgery, nor, I think, the temperament for it. His hand in the letters I've examined is that of a careful but unimaginative man. Pike, as clerk to the court, had access of a different kind, and knowledge certainly, but Pike's part, as we have established, was that of the witness who recanted, which argues a man used as an instrument rather than one directing the whole. That leaves Sir Julian himself, I said, or someone acting upon his instructions. It leaves Sir Julian, Holmes agreed, or the Reverend Henshaw, who has been connected with the Verner family by Fenwick's own account for a very great many years, and whose slip of the tongue, that unfortunate matter, has remained, I confess, very much in my thoughts. A clergyman, Watson, is not the first person one thinks of as a forger, but a clergyman of that generation was very often a man of considerable education, with a fine, practised hand from years of writing sermons and parish registers, and with access through long friendship to a great deal of private correspondence that might never come under the scrutiny of lawyers. He fell silent, and I saw him turn the matter over for some minutes, his eyes fixed upon nothing in particular, in the manner that I had learned to leave entirely undisturbed. "Consider the whole sequence, Watson," he said at last, "as it must have appeared to those who lived through it. Eleanor Graves, daughter of Sir Marcus by an early connection he had never publicly acknowledged, learns, perhaps from her dying mother, perhaps from papers left to her, that her father had in his last years determined to make some provision for her and had set it down in writing. She comes to London, retains counsel, and brings her petition. The genuine letters exist. They are sent to counsel for examination. They are pronounced authentic. And then, between the 9th of October and the hearing itself, something is done. A forged letter, crude enough to be exposed, is substituted for the genuine bundle, or perhaps placed among them. Pike, the clerk, who has perhaps already glimpsed the genuine codicil, or been told of its existence, is persuaded, by what means I cannot yet say, though I suspect they were not gentle, to recant whatever testimony he had been prepared to give in Miss Graves's favour. The forged letter is exposed at the hearing precisely as its makers intended. Miss Graves's case collapses in disgrace. The genuine letters and the codicil itself vanish into a sealed packet, there to remain undisturbed for 25 years. And Eleanor Graves herself, ruined, disgraced, and without resource, in a city that has just publicly branded her an impostor and a fraud. I think we need not look very far, Watson, for the manner of her disappearance, though I hope, for the sake of whatever remains of human decency in this affair, that it was poverty and obscurity rather than anything more violent that closed her account." Holmes rose abruptly, and I saw upon his face an expression of cold anger such as I had rarely witnessed in him. For Holmes, whatever the world might suppose of his reasoning machinery, was not a man indifferent to cruelty, particularly cruelty that hid itself behind the forms of law and the appearance of respectability. "Every person now connected with this case, Watson," said he, "Mowbray excepted, perhaps, who is too young to have had any part in the original wrong. Every one of them carries some portion of this old debt upon his conscience, whether as architect, instrument, or beneficiary. Fenwick, I believe, had begun at last to pay his portion, and was struck down for it. The question that remains, Watson, is which of the others has spent 25 years dreading the day when the reckoning might fall upon him in turn, and which of them, when that day came, chose murder rather than confession." Chapter 7. The Obvious Culprit. I had supposed, after the conversation recorded in my last chapter, that Holmes's inquiries would now turn decisively towards Sir Julian Verner and the Reverend Henshaw, as the persons whose part in the events of 1887 appeared, upon his own reasoning, the most considerable. I was therefore somewhat surprised when, upon our arrival at Lincoln's Inn the following morning, we found the offices in a state of subdued excitement, and Lestrade awaiting us with the brisk, satisfied air of a man who believes his work very nearly done. "You may save yourself further trouble, Mr. Holmes," said he, as we came in, "for I think we have got to the bottom of this business, and I don't mind telling you it has turned out rather differently than either of us expected." "Indeed," said Holmes, with no more than polite interest. "Pray enlighten us." "It's young Mowbray," said Lestrade, lowering his voice somewhat, though there was no one within earshot to overhear him. "We searched Fenwick's private desk this morning, a thing that should have been done at once, if you ask me, but there it is, and we found, locked in a drawer to which only Fenwick had the key, a quantity of papers that put quite a different complexion on the case." He led us into the small room that had served as Fenwick's study, where a constable stood guard over a roll-top desk, its lid raised, and a quantity of documents spread upon the table beside it. "These," said Lestrade, taking up a sheaf of papers covered in a neat, decisive hand, "are notes, memoranda, you might call them, setting out, in some detail, a series of irregularities in the firm's accounts over the past 3 years. Sums advanced to clients and never properly repaid, trust moneys applied, for a time, to purposes for which they were never intended, and afterward made good, but made good, Mr. Holmes, from sources that don't appear in any ledger I can find. And every one of these irregularities, according to Fenwick's own notes, traces back to transactions authorised by Harold Mowbray." "I see," said Holmes, taking the papers and turning them over with apparent care, though I observed that his eyes moved over them with a speed that suggested he had grasped their substance almost at a glance. "And Fenwick had evidently been engaged in compiling this evidence for some time. For some months, by the look of it. It would seem, Mr. Holmes, that Fenwick had discovered his junior partner's hand in the till, so to speak, and was building a case against him, meaning no doubt either to confront him with it, or to lay it before the Law Society. Mowbray, getting wind of this, and a man in his position would have ample opportunity to do so, took the only course left to him. He came to Fenwick in the vault, on some pretext or other, struck him down, and made off with whatever papers he could find that touched upon the matter. Papers which, I don't doubt, Mr. Holmes, are a good deal more dangerous to young Mowbray than any packet from 1887. "And the packet itself?" Holmes asked. "You no longer regard its disappearance as significant?" "Oh, as to that," said Lestrade, with the slightly impatient air of a man brushing aside a minor inconvenience, "I dare say Mowbray took it along with the rest, simply to confuse the issue, or it may be that it was never taken at all, but mislaid in the general disorder, and will turn up yet when Miss Ashcroft has had time to set the archive in order. The main point, Mr. Holmes, is the motive, and the motive is plain enough. Mowbray stood to lose everything, his position, his liberty, very possibly, if Fenwick's inquiries had gone forward, and he stood to gain everything, the senior partnership included, by Fenwick's death. We have found besides a witness, one of the clerks, who states that he saw Mowbray descending toward the vault at an hour the previous evening when he had no ordinary business to be there. "This is excellent work, Lestrade," said Holmes, and though the words were courteous enough, I, who had grown accustomed to the particular shades of his voice, detected in them a certain reserve that I do not think Lestrade himself perceived. "You have arrested him, I collect?" "Within the hour, Mr. Holmes. He's protesting his innocence loudly enough, as they generally do, but the evidence speaks for itself, and I fancy the Director of Public Prosecutions will think so too." We took our leave shortly afterward, and I confess that as we walked back through the grey streets toward Baker Street, I found myself more than half persuaded by Lestrade's reasoning. The discovery of Fenwick's notes, the witness who had seen Mowbray near the vault, the plain and pressing motive of a man facing ruin and disgrace. These were not trifles, and they fitted, moreover, with a fact that had troubled me from the first, namely, that Mowbray, of all the persons we had met, was the one whose connection to the events of 1887 had seemed least apparent, and whose presence in the case had therefore wanted explanation. "It does seem to answer very well, Holmes," I ventured as we walked. "If Mowbray had discovered some hint of the old scandal, and a man rummaging through the firm's papers in search of evidence against himself might well stumble upon a sealed packet marked 1887 and wonder at it, he might have taken it on impulse, along with Fenwick's notes concerning his own misdeeds, simply to remove anything that might attract scrutiny to the vault and its contents." "It does answer very well," Holmes agreed, in a tone that, far from reassuring me, increased my unease. "It answers, Watson, almost too well. Consider how neatly it falls out. Lestrade has been searching for 3 days for some tangible link between a living man and Fenwick's death, and has found nothing, until this morning, when a drawer that has presumably been searched already, in the ordinary course of the investigation, yields up, all at once, a complete and damning case against the one person in this affair whose motive is of the ordinary comprehensible sort. Money, position, the fear of exposure. It is precisely the kind of case, Watson, that a jury will accept without difficulty, and precisely the kind of case that will close this inquiry in the public mind within a week." "You think the evidence was placed there?" "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that a man who has spent 25 years successfully concealing one crime might be expected to show some particular skill in arranging the appearance of another. I noticed, Watson, though I said nothing to Lestrade, for I wished to consider it further, that the ink of those memoranda, like the ink of the altered register entry we examined some days ago, possessed a gloss that argued recent writing, and Fenwick's hand, while a fair imitation, was not, I think, quite Fenwick's hand. There was a certain squareness to the capitals, particularly the letter G, that I have seen somewhere very recently, though I cannot at this moment place it with certainty." We walked on for some distance in silence, and I confess that the newspaper placards we passed that evening, already proclaiming in large type the arrest of a Chancery Lane solicitor for the murder of his senior partner, did nothing to lighten my spirits, for I could see that public opinion, once it had fastened upon so plausible and so satisfying an explanation, would not readily be persuaded to abandon it, whatever doubts Holmes might privately entertain. "Even you, Watson," said Holmes quietly as we reached our own door, "have wondered, this past half hour, whether the case might not, after all, be as simple as Lestrade believes. I do not blame you for it. It is a very natural thing to wonder, and that, I think, is precisely why someone has taken such pains to make you wonder it. But I will tell you this. Somewhere in this affair there is a letter, Watson, a letter beginning with the same squarely formed capitals I noticed this afternoon, and when I have found it, and compared it with what I have seen today, I think we shall know a very great deal more than Inspector Lestrade does at this hour. He said no more that evening, but I observed that he did not go to bed, and that the lamp in our sitting room burned long after I'd retired, throwing its faint light beneath my door until very late I fell asleep. Chapter 8. Holmes's Experiment. I woke the following morning to find Holmes already gone out, and a note propped against the coffee pot in his own hand, requesting that I should join him at Lincoln's Inn by 10 o'clock, and adding in a postscript that I should bring with me my old service revolver. Not, I think, that we shall have need of it, Watson, but a man who has waited 25 years for an answer may not relish being given one, and I should prefer that we were prepared for any humour he may be in. I confess that this postscript did little to settle my mind during the cab ride that followed, and it was with some relief that I found, upon my arrival, that the atmosphere of the place was one of quiet activity rather than alarm. Holmes was in the vault itself, in his shirt-sleeves with the great iron door standing open beside him, and Miss Ashcroft and a locksmith, a small grey man with a bag of tools, in attendance. "Ah, Watson, you're come at the right moment," said he, looking up. "I've spent the morning, with Mr. Gedge's kind assistance, in taking this lock entirely to pieces, and I believe I have at last resolved the difficulty that has troubled me from the first, namely, how a door secured by a bar that can only be drawn from within came, nevertheless, to be found so secured upon a morning when its only occupant lay dead upon the floor. You have found some mechanism, some trick of the lock itself. I have found something a good deal simpler than that, Watson, and a good deal more instructive, for it concerns not the lock, but the man who used it. You will recall that I remarked upon our first examination that the bar was old, and required a particular pressure, first downward, then across, before it would run home, and that a stranger, fumbling with it in haste, might very well fail to secure it upon the first attempt. I recall it. What I did not then know, what I have learned only this morning from Mr. Gedge, who has serviced this lock for upward of 20 years, is that the bar, when it is not driven fully home, does not remain visibly open. It comes to rest, instead, in a position which appears to any but the most careful eye indistinguishable from the locked position, the bar lying across the door in its groove exactly as it should, while in fact the end of it has not yet entered the socket cut into the stone, and a firm push from without, applied to the door itself rather than to the bar, will force it the remaining half-inch into place, exactly as though the door had been locked from within all along. I stared at him. Then the door might have been pushed shut, and appear locked, by someone standing outside it. By someone standing outside it, Holmes agreed, who had drawn the bar 3/4 of the way home before leaving, a thing easily done, Watson, by reaching round the edge of the door as it stands ajar, and who then drew the door to behind him and gave it a single firm push. The remaining motion of the bar, completing its journey into the socket, would produce precisely the sound and precisely the appearance of a door locked from within by its sole occupant. Mr. Gedge has demonstrated it to me 3 times this morning, and each time with complete success. But Holmes, the keys, both keys were accounted for. Fenwick's lay beside his body. "The keys," said Holmes, "secure the outer mechanism, the great lock proper by which the door is fastened when the vault is not in use. The bar is a separate matter entirely, an interior precaution, dating, as I surmised, from an earlier period, and intended to prevent the door being opened from without while someone worked inside, a precaution against accidental intrusion, Watson, rather than against burglary, and one which, I suspect, very few persons now living had occasion to think much about, save one who had, at some time, occasion to use it himself, and to notice its peculiarity. And who would that be? That, said Holmes, is a question I have already answered to my own satisfaction, though not yet to the satisfaction of a jury. Come with me, Watson. There is one more experiment I wish to make, and I think Miss Ashcroft can assist us in it. We went up to the archive room, where Holmes asked Miss Ashcroft whether the firm possessed any specimen of Mr. Pike's handwriting from the years of his clerkship, some old memorandum or a marginal note in one of the ledgers, written before his retirement. "There are a great many such notes, Mr. Holmes," said she, somewhat puzzled, and produced after a brief search an old docket book in which Pike, in his years as clerk, had recorded the attendance of counsel and the disposal of papers in a small, careful, old-fashioned hand. Holmes laid this beside the memoranda discovered the previous day in Fenwick's desk, the papers that purported to set out Mowbray's financial irregularities, and beside these, in turn, he laid the 3 anonymous letters that Fenwick had first brought to Baker Street. "Observe, Watson," said he, "the formation of the capital G in each of these 3 documents, in Pike's old docket book, in the memoranda found yesterday, and in the second of the anonymous letters, where the word Graves itself appears. In each case the letter is formed with a small square hook at the foot of the downstroke, a trick of the hand, Watson, that a man develops over 40 years of careful penmanship, and which he cannot, however he may disguise the rest of his writing, entirely suppress. The anonymous letters were written in a disguised hand, certainly, larger, more upright, the natural slope reversed, but that small hook persists, in every example, with a fidelity that no deliberate disguise could achieve by accident. "Pike," I said slowly, "Pike wrote the anonymous letters, and Pike forged the memoranda against Mowbray." "I believe so, and I believe, further, that it was Pike who removed the leaf from the daybook 25 years ago, for the cut, Watson, when I examined it again this morning with particular care, was made with a blade held in the left hand, as a left-handed man would naturally hold it. And Mr. Pike, I observed when he extended his hand to us upon our first meeting, wears his watch upon his right wrist, in the manner of a man who finds his left hand the more convenient for such purposes. Then it was Pike who substituted the forged letter for Eleanor Graves's genuine correspondence, and Pike who recanted his testimony, and Pike who, 25 years later, murdered Fenwick to prevent the truth coming out, and then attempted to lay the blame upon Mowbray by forging evidence against him. So I believe, Watson, though I confess there remains one point upon which my reasoning, however sound, cannot yet supply the want of proof, the question of motive. A man does not commit single-handed the elaborate fraud of 1887, nor the murder that has followed it, without some powerful reason of his own, and Pike, as we have seen him, is no master criminal, but a frightened old clerk who has spent a lifetime, I think, obeying instructions he dared not refuse. I wish to know, Watson, whose instructions those were, for I do not believe even now that Pike has told us the whole of this story, and I think the time has come to ask him to tell it. He gathered the papers together with great care, and there was upon his face, as he did so, an expression I had seen before, the look of a man who has solved a puzzle of facts and finds himself now confronted with the more difficult puzzle of a human soul. "Send for Lestrade, Watson," said he quietly, "and ask Miss Ashcroft whether Sir Julian and the Reverend Henshaw might be persuaded to attend here this afternoon. I think, before the day is out, we shall have the whole of this matter laid bare, though I confess I take very little pleasure in the prospect. Chapter 9. The Secret of the Vault. By 4 o'clock that afternoon the firm's library had been arranged, at Holmes's request, in a manner that struck me, even before a word had been spoken, as having about it something of the solemnity of a courtroom, though without its formality. A long table had been drawn before the fire, and about it were gathered Sir Julian Verner, the Reverend Henshaw, Miss Ashcroft, and a little apart from the others, old Pike, who sat with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance, as a man might sit who has long ceased to expect anything from the world but its judgment. Lestrade stood near the door, with the air of a man prepared to be either vindicated or disappointed, according to which way the matter fell out, and Mowbray himself, released that morning upon Holmes's representations to the yard, sat at the table's foot pale and watchful, but I thought no longer afraid. Holmes stood before the fire, and when he began to speak it was in the quiet, measured tone he reserved for those occasions, rare enough in my experience, when the matter in hand touched upon something more than the mere mechanics of crime. "I will not detain you longer than is necessary," said he, "for I think most of what I have to say will come as no great surprise to at least one person in this room, and as a very considerable surprise to the rest. I propose, therefore, to begin not with the death of Mr. Fenwick 4 days ago, but with an event that took place 25 years before it, an event which I believe to be, in every particular that matters, its true cause." He told them then, much as he had told me, of Eleanor Graves and her petition, of the genuine letters sent to council and pronounced authentic, and of the forged letter that had been produced in their place, of the recantation that had broken her case beyond repair, and of the young woman's disappearance, unrecorded and unremarked, into the obscurity from which she had so briefly emerged. I watched the faces about the table as he spoke. Sir Julian's countenance, which had begun in an attitude of polite, faintly bored attention, grew gradually rigid, as a man's face grows rigid who hears, for the first time stated plainly, a thing he has known privately for a great while. The Reverend Henshaw's hands, folded before him upon the table, had begun very slightly to tremble. "The substitution of the forged letter," Holmes continued, "required access to the genuine correspondence, knowledge of the proceedings, and a particular skill of hand. I had supposed, until this morning, that these 3 qualities might be found combined in more than one person now in this room. I find now that I was mistaken, for the skill of hand belonged to one man only, and that man has carried it, and the knowledge that went with it for 25 years, in a silence that has at last become more than he could bear." He turned, and for the first time looked directly at Pike. "You wrote the anonymous letters, Mr. Pike," said he, not unkindly. "You forged the memoranda found in Mr. Fenwick's desk in an attempt, a clumsy one, I'm afraid, though understandable in a man acting under great strain, to direct suspicion toward Mr. Mowbray, and it was you, 25 years ago, who removed the leaf from the daybook and substituted a forged letter for the genuine correspondence between Sir Marcus Verner and his daughter. A forgery, Mr. Pike, that I believe you yourself executed, for you possess, as I have had occasion to observe, both the skill and the particular formation of hand that the work required." For a long moment there was silence. Then Pike, without raising his eyes, said, in a voice so low that I think only those nearest him could hear it at all, "Yes." "I had thought, until yesterday," Holmes went on, "that you had acted in 1887 upon the instructions of another, that you were an instrument, Mr. Pike, rather than a principal. I confess I am no longer certain of it, and I think for your own sake as much as for ours, you'd better tell us the whole of it now, in your own words." Pike sat for a moment longer in silence, and then, slowly, as though some long-sustained effort had at last given way, he began to speak, and his voice, as he did so, lost something of its tremor, and took on instead the flat, exhausted steadiness of a man setting down, at last, a burden he has carried so long that its absence feels almost like a second weight. "I was a young man then, Mr. Holmes, and ambitious, more ambitious than my station warranted, though I did not see it so at the time. When Sir Marcus died, and the question of Miss Graves's claim arose, I came to know, through papers that passed through my hands as clerk, that the letters were genuine, and that there was, besides, a codicil, properly executed, which I myself had seen, folded among Sir Marcus's private papers, not 3 weeks before his death. I do not say that any man told me, in plain words, to destroy what I had seen. No one needed to. I understood, well enough, what would be expected of a clerk who held in his own hands papers that could ruin the family whose patronage he hoped, one day, to enjoy. I made the forgery myself, Mr. Holmes, in a single night, working from a genuine letter as my model. I gave evidence that I knew to be false, and when Miss Graves's case collapsed, I was rewarded, not with money, for that would have left a trace, but with advancement. A better situation, secured for me, very quietly, through influence I had no right to expect. "Whose influence, Mr. Pike?" Holmes asked very gently. Pike's eyes moved for the first time toward the Reverend Henshaw, and the old clergyman, who had sat throughout this recitation with his head bowed and his hands pressed together as though in prayer, made a small sound, scarcely more than a sigh, and did not lift his head. "I do not say Mr. Henshaw told me to do it," Pike said, with a kind of weary fairness that I found, in the circumstances, almost unbearable to hear. "I say only that he knew of the codicil as I did. He had witnessed it indeed at Sir Marcus's request, some weeks before the old gentleman died, and that when the time came he said nothing, though a word from him would have ended the matter at once in Miss Graves's favour. He has lived with that silence, I think, a good deal longer than I have lived with my forgery, for a forger may at least tell himself in his weaker moments that he was deceived as to the facts. A witness who says nothing has no such comfort." "This is true, Mr. Holmes," said Henshaw in a voice that seemed to have aged a decade since I had last heard it. "I have prayed for that young woman, these 25 years, more often than I have prayed for anything else in my life, and I have never in all that time found the courage to do for her, living, what I now find myself at last attempting to do for her memory." "And Fenwick?" Holmes asked. "When did he come to know the truth?" "A fortnight ago," said Henshaw. "I went to him myself, Mr. Holmes. I could bear it no longer, and Fenwick was the only one of us, I think, who had grown, with age, into something better than the young man he had been. I told him everything, the codicil, the forgery, Pike's part in it, and my own. Fenwick was appalled, Mr. Holmes, more appalled, I think, than I had dared hope, and he resolved, at once, to find what remained of the truth among the firm's papers, and to see Miss Graves's name restored, whatever the cost to the rest of us." "And Pike," said Holmes, turning back to the old clerk, "learned of this? How?" "Fenwick told me himself," said Pike, 2 days before he died. "He came to me, Mr. Holmes, not in anger, but with something very like kindness. He said he intended to make the truth known, but that he would do what he could to spare me the worst of it, in consideration of my age and my long service. He meant it as mercy, I think. I heard it only as ruin. 40 years of respectability, Mr. Holmes, gone, at the stroke of a pen, and replaced by disgrace, and very likely prison, in the few years that remain to me. I went to him that night, in the vault, meaning only to plead with him, to beg him, for the sake of an old man's last years, to let the matter rest. He would not. We argued. I do not clearly remember striking him, Mr. Holmes. I have asked myself every hour since whether I meant it, and I cannot tell you the truth of that, even now. But I remember what I did afterward, with a clearness that has not left me for one moment since. I took the packet, and I arranged the door as you have described, and I went home, and I have not slept since that night, for more than an hour together. Chapter 10. The Judgment of Time. There is little more to tell, and I have often thought that this in itself is among the strangest features of the whole affair, for cases that begin in such darkness and confusion commonly end, in my experience, with some flurry of action, some final pursuit or confrontation, that brings the matter to its close with a kind of dramatic finality. This case ended otherwise. It ended with an old man's quiet voice in a firelit room, and with a silence afterward that none of us seemed inclined to break. Lestrade, to his credit, made no difficulty over what followed. He took Pike into custody himself, with a gentleness that surprised me, and I heard him say, as he did so, something to the effect that a man's years ought to count for something, even in such a business as this, a sentiment which, coming from Lestrade, struck me as more creditable than any number of clever deductions. Pike went with him without protest, and indeed with something that looked almost like relief, as though the prospect of whatever awaited him was after all a lighter burden than the one he had carried these 25 years. Of the days that followed I shall say only a little, for much of it concerns matters of law, and of family arrangement that fall outside the proper scope of these memoirs. The packet itself was found, in the end, exactly where Pike said he had hidden it, in the false bottom of an old deed box in his own lodgings, a box that had stood, Holmes remarked, in plain view upon a shelf for years, which is so often the way, Watson, with things that men cannot bring themselves either to destroy or to part with. Within it were the genuine letters from Sir Marcus Verner to his daughter, and the codicil itself, faded but perfectly legible, by which Sir Marcus had acknowledged Eleanor Graves as his daughter, and provided for her, out of his estate, a sum which, with 25 years of accumulated interest upon the principal that ought to have been hers, amounted now to a very considerable fortune indeed. Sir Julian Verner, when the matter was laid before him in its fullness, behaved, I am bound to say, in a manner that did him more credit than anything else I observed of him during the whole affair. He had been, Holmes was satisfied, entirely innocent of the original fraud, a young man of 23 at the time, newly come into his inheritance, and kept, by those who had contrived the matter, in a convenient ignorance of how that inheritance had been secured. But ignorance, once it is broken, leaves a man no further excuse, and Sir Julian did not seek one. He instructed his solicitors, not this time Fenwick's firm, which had its own griefs to settle, to make over to the estate of Eleanor Graves, wheresoever it might be found to lie, the whole of the sum that the codicil had specified, together with such further provision as the lawyers judged equitable in the circumstances. It remained only to discover what had become of Eleanor Graves herself, and here Holmes, who had pursued the question with a quiet persistence that I had not fully appreciated until its result was laid before me, was able to supply an answer that was, I confess, more melancholy than I had hoped, though less so than I had feared. Miss Graves had not, as Holmes had once gently suggested might be the case, met with any violent end. She had lived, under a changed name, in considerable poverty, in a small town in the north of England, working for many years as a schoolmistress, respected by her neighbours and entirely unsuspected by any of them of having once stood at the centre of a Chancery scandal. She died some 6 years previously, of an illness that poverty had done nothing to ease, and had left behind her as her sole legacy a single pupil whom she had taught without fee for several years, and who had gone on, through Miss Graves's quiet encouragement, to a position as a junior mistress in a school of her own. It was to this young woman, who bore, as it happened, no blood relation to Eleanor Graves whatever, but who had been, in every sense that seemed to matter, her true legacy, that the restored fortune was eventually directed through a trust established, at Holmes's quiet suggestion, in Miss Graves's name, and I have always found something fitting in the thought that the money which had been wrongly withheld from one schoolmistress should come, in the end, to assist another, and that the line of consequence, broken so cruelly 25 years before, should thus be mended, if not restored. The Reverend Henshaw resigned his living within the month, and retired to a small cottage in Dorset, where, I am told, he occupies himself chiefly with parish histories and with a correspondence, conducted through intermediaries, with certain charitable institutions concerned with the welfare of women left, as Eleanor Graves had been left, without resource or protection. Whether this represents penance, or merely the natural occupation of an old man with time upon his hands and a conscience he can no longer outrun, I do not pretend to judge. Holmes, when I put the question to him, replied only that the distinction, Watson, may matter less to the women who are helped than it does to the man who helps them, a remark that struck me, at the time, as characteristically evasive, though I have since come to think it one of the wisest things I ever heard him say. As for Mowbray, he remained with the firm, and indeed became, in time, its senior partner, a position he holds, I believe, to this day, and one which, I am glad to record, he has filled with a steadiness that has done much to restore the confidence that the events of that autumn had, for a time, severely shaken. It was upon the evening of the day when the last of these arrangements had been settled that Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire, and I found myself turning the whole matter over, as I have done many times since, in search of some conclusion that might do justice to it. "It is a curious thing, Holmes," said I at last, "that a crime committed 25 years ago, by men who believed it buried beyond recovery, should reach out after so long a time and claim a victim who had no part in it at all, for Fenwick, whatever his youthful failings, died trying to undo the wrong, not to perpetuate it." "It is curious, Watson," said Holmes, "only if one supposes that time has any power to alter the nature of a fact. It does not. A fact, once it exists always. It may be hidden, denied, forgotten by every living soul who once knew it, but it does not, for any of that, cease to be true. Pike believed for 25 years that he had destroyed the truth about Eleanor Graves. He had not destroyed it. He had only hidden it in a sealed packet in a locked vault behind an altered register, much as a man might hide a body, believing that concealment and destruction were the same thing. They are not. The body remains, the fact remains, and sooner or later, Watson, by some accident of chance or some stirring of conscience, the hand comes that turns the key." He fell silent for a time, gazing into the fire, and when he spoke again it was in a tone I had not often heard from him, reflective, almost gentle, as though he spoke less to me than to himself. "I confess, Watson, that of all the cases we have shared together, I find myself thinking of this one rather differently than the rest. There was no great criminal here, no mastermind whose downfall might furnish a satisfying conclusion. There was only an old man's fear, and an old man's silence, and the quiet accumulating weight of 25 years, until at last that weight became too great, and something broke. I do not know that there is any lesson in it, beyond the one I have already given you, but I think, Watson, that it is perhaps the truest lesson of all the cases I have brought you, that the past does not pass away merely because we have stopped looking at it, and that justice, however long delayed, has a patience that exceeds even our own." He said no more, and I did not press him, and so, in the quiet of that November evening, with the fog pressing close against our windows and the fire burning low, there ended the affair which I have here set down as the case of the locked Chancery vault, a case in which, as Holmes himself observed, memory proved stronger than secrecy, and justice, arriving a quarter-century late, was not, after all, too late.